Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Tom Ricks. This is the second of an 11-part series called How to Fix Everything, Eagle as Phoenix. The topic for today is how to fix our police forces. The term in the title, Wolves to Dogs, does not in any way, shape, or form imply that there's anything bad or evil about wolves or police or dogs. Specifically, I am referring to the well-documented archaeological and sociological phenomena in which dogs were among the first species we domesticated. There are a lot of different thoughts as to exactly how this occurred, but the most leading phenomena is that basically wolves embraced a symbiotic relationship with nomadic bands of humans, and over time evolved characteristics that made them both more attractive to and more useful to the humans around them. Wolves are a vital part of any ecosystem in which they exist. Dogs are a companion species that have been with us since the dawn of civilization, without whom, I would argue, civilization might not have been possible, and even failing that argument, at a minimum, have provided an invaluable service in agriculture, industry, war, and companionship. Why am I making the alliteration between the domestication of dogs and police if I'm going out of my way to say that there's nothing evil or wrong about wolves or dogs or police? The reason that I am using that term is because, as noble and important as wolves are to our ecosystem, very few people on this planet could responsibly have a wolf as a pet. I'm not going to say nobody, because I've known some pretty exceptional dog or animal owners, but by and large, a wolf is not genetically hardwired to be friendly to a family. Conversely, almost every dog is hardwired at a genetic level to be loyal and friendly to everyone, certainly its owners. And unless a dog is emotionally abused, it is a loving companion and helpful to almost everyone around it. And for the record, I like cats too, and horses and a lot of other animals. My point here of using this analogy is that in America, I can't speak for law enforcement all over the world, although there are other countries with our problem, but definitely in the United States, our police forces have been militarized. This is a well-documented phenomenon, and I am not going to go into great detail in this podcast about how that happened. Suffice to say that the unaccountable behavior that we have seen by a demonstrably bad element within the police force is a clear and present sign that there are problems at an institutional level. And by institution, I don't mean any individual city, because the problems we see with systemic abuse and the cover-up of that abuse and the tolerance of that abuse happens, by my observation, in nearly every city in America. There are some select cities that have gone out of their way to engage in systemic and repeated reform to the point that the majority of the officers in these cities do not engage in the racist and sexist behavior that we see being protested in the NFL and a number of prominent sports leagues. I'm not going to talk about the protest movement either. Black Lives Matter is very well documented, and if you aren't familiar with it, you should do your homework and learn about what they're saying and why they are saying what they are. Suffice to say that there is a problem, and this problem needs to be addressed. And in my opinion, hitherto now, the solution, more or less, can be categorized as informing the populace. There are, of course, many efforts beyond that, including a push for community policing, boards of citizens, and I think all of these individually are great. What I don't see is a systemic movement for a specific across-the-board fix, like I do, for example, with, say, the minimum wage effort. That's a very well-coordinated effort looking for a very specific, very tangible goal, $15 an hour, targeting one company after another until, or one government at a state level or the national level, until it gets done. So I think that as noble and as important as the efforts right now going on for police reform are, I think that a simple, tiny refocus could achieve tremendous results, which is the reason I used the the metaphor that I did. I think we need to demilitarize our police forces, and I think that the way we do that is to take advantage of who controls where most of the police forces currently exist, which is to say that while there are police and law enforcement in every jurisdiction in America, whether it be state or federal or county or city or town, or even, unofficial incorporated areas, including tribes or corporate areas or private police departments and things like Disney World or, military police, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, where there is law, by definition, there must be someone to enforce that law. There's some other problems that a few people are aware of, but I do want to address really quickly before I go into the specifics of my proposal. Another really fundamental problem with police reform is the fact that district attorneys are historically very reluctant to prosecute police because they work with them on a daily basis, and prosecutors that are considered hostile to police don't get the cooperation of police unions and police. And as a result, basically the very mechanisms that are supposedly designed to hold police in check are very rarely used. And when they are used, then the police unions, especially the national order called the Fraternal Order of Police, make it their business to target these prosecutors as hostile to police. And I want to point out specifically with the Fraternal Order of Police that I am a big supporter of unions. In fact, one of these 11 things is going to be the importance of unions. But any institution that does not serve all of the stakeholders involved is a flawed institution. In the case of the Fraternal Order of Police, they serve the police, but they don't serve the citizens, and they don't serve every other institution that is designed to function within that. If the Fraternal Order of Police is in any way, shape, or form protecting police that are involved in racial shootings, and they have been, then there is a problem with the Fraternal Order of Police. And external pressure that is not biased in favor of unconditional support of law enforcement officers needs to be brought to bear. And I believe that the place to bring that to bear is our large cities. State governments, with some exceptions, due to the balance between rural and metro areas lean to, and in some cases heavily favor, conservative governments. Our federal system was designed that way from the get-go by Thomas Jefferson. I have stated in the other podcast my desire to rewrite the Constitution, but I'm focusing entirely on, in this series, purely constitutional means to fix this. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution delegates all rights to individuals that are not explicitly mentioned elsewhere in the document. The 9th Amendment to the Constitution delegates all rights to the states not explicitly given to the federal government. And the 14th Amendment clearly gives all rights given by the federal government supremacy over the states. Now, I would personally love to see an interpretation of the Constitution that says that that means that the unspoken rights found in the 10th Amendment can, via the 14th Amendment, be applied to the states. And specifically what I'm saying is, I believe that since state governments tend to lean Republican and city governments tend to lean liberal, that I would like to see a federal act empowering cities. And I'm going to talk about a lot more about that in a different podcast. I'm going to focus like a laser beam, though, on one element of that. Most large cities, in fact, by and large, all large metro areas, lean very heavily Democratic. The problem is that mayors elected in these Democratic cities very often need to appear tough on crime. It is considered a political talking point to have close relations with the police union and the firefighters union, and as well it should. Our first responders are, by and large, heroes. I could go on about the Stanford prison experiment. I just simply recommend that you look it up. And the short thumbnail answer for that, even though some people consider it academically unsure and unsound science, I think that just a simple observation of human nature could still say that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And since police are humans, and that they, as human beings, if they are shown that there is no accountability for their actions, the temptation in a job that involves putting themselves on the line on a regular basis, that routinely invokes post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, many veterans actually end up becoming police, is a situation in which we have a culture where law enforcement officials are excused by the same portion of the population that found a rapist to be okay to go to the Supreme Court. We're not going to fix that portion of our culture overnight, but what we can do is we can make sure that in the Democratic Party and in our cities, that it is no longer acceptable for a mayor to be tough on crime. Now, I know that recently a lot of centrist Democrats have begun to take flack for the trend in the 1990s to refer to a lot of people of color as super predators, or stereotypes about Mexicans or gangs or crack that were clearly racially motivated, including ridiculously disparate sentencing guidelines and the results of sentencing, the school to prison pipeline. Again, you can Google that and learn about it outside of this podcast. Suffice to say that at an institutional level, if you are paying attention to any of the statistics, unless you believe in eugenics and a genetic superiority of the white race, i.e. you are a tiki torch carrying member of the Nazi Party, you're going to understand that our supposed meritocracy is a lie. And if that is the case, then we need to respond to that. And the most natural inclination of many of our progressive politicians is to initiate economic justice programs, redistribution of wealth, expanding the safety net, Medicare for all of these things will definitely reduce crime, will increase the productivity of our citizens. But what they won't do is they won't fix the systemic problems in the culture of our law enforcement. And I want to add one more thing. A lot of these things that we want to do theoretically would happen with popular protest. And if you pay any attention to the news, you will see that a disturbing recent trend that has, in my opinion, been going on since at least the Occupy movement, and I arguably before that, but certainly since the Occupy movement, has been a coordination between law enforcement officials at the federal level and our local level, where just do me a favor. Look into the coordination between the Department of Homeland Security and the local law enforcement officials that conducted a coordinated federal strike against the Occupy movement with our local police departments. And when you factor in on top of that since the Bush administration, the Pentagon has been selling surplus military equipment to our police departments, what you have is a fifth branch of the military, or the federalization of our police. And if you know anything at all about the intent of our founding fathers, they were terrified about this idea. In fact, that was a reason why we did not have a Federal Bureau of Investigation for close to 100 years. The reason is because law enforcement is not supposed to be a military activity. There is actually a law called the Passe Comentes Act, which basically forbids the military from acting in law enforcement unless military law has been declared. So hawks, particularly people who are opposed to Democrats and street protests, or the ability to express our First Amendment rights, are working their way around that by turning the civilian police into a military force. The way we counter that is national certification. What we need is an alliance of like-minded progressive organizations, Black Lives Matter, the Democratic Party, maybe Me Too, just an umbrella of organizations to come together and create a standard of acceptable police behavior. Law enforcement should be involved in this. Reasonable law enforcement that believes in gun background checks, law enforcement that acknowledges that there is a problem, law enforcement that supports NFL protests. Anybody who is against the NFL protests should not be included in this dialogue. Anyone who thought that Trayvon Martin had it coming should not be involved in this dialogue. This certification needs to be something similar to the unofficial function served by the American Bar Association for non-rapist judges, or the League of Women Voters for debates. And this standard, this gold standard, needs to be enforced by voters in cities one at a time until we change the Overton window, and look that up if you need to, but it's basically the accepted norm of behavior for centrists, back to a police peace officer who only reaches for his gun when his life is genuinely threatened or the life of someone else is genuinely threatened, and not being a hair-trigger comedy act. Right now, our police forces are a joke. A joke. It is the darkest of black comedy, but it is pathetic that so many of them refuse to hold their fellows to account. In a perfect world, quite frankly, this reform should have come from within.